Imagine this, you're 6 years old, still playing with dolls, still learning to read. And yet you're standing in front of a king wearing a golden crown being told you're now Queen of England. This isn't fiction. This was Isabella of Valois, a forgotten child queen married off to a man 23 years. Older not for love but for peace between warring nations. She didn't choose the crown. She didn't choose the king. And soon she'd lose them both. But her story doesn't end there. In fact, what happens after the wedding is what history rarely tells you: betrayal, imprisonment, lost power, and a second fate that's just as tragic in. This video you'll uncover why a 6-year-old French princess became a political pawn, how she lived in a royal English court more like a dollhouse than a palace, and how her short, quiet life shaped royal alliances for generations, even though most history books leave her name out completely. Ellerler happened behind the royal curtains, and how a child's fate was used to stop a war stayed with us until the end, because her final years might just change the way you see medieval royalty forever. Welcome to History Screen, where we bring you the stories time tried to erase. If you enjoy forgotten history, power struggles, and dramatic tales from the past, subscribe now and join our journey into the shadows of history. Isabella of Valois was born in November 1389, right in the heart of medieval Paris. She wasn't just any child. She was a princess, the daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. But Isabella's world was far from peaceful. Her birth took place during one of the most violent periods in European history, the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict between England and France that had already raged for decades. Her father, King Charles, was known as Charles the Mad, and not without reason. He suffered terrifying episodes of mental illness, often forgetting who he was, or even attacking his own people. His instability shook the entire French kingdom. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It left a dangerous power vacuum in the court. That meant political chaos and constant tension among the nobility. Isabella, just a child, was born into this storm. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, became one of the most powerful women in France by necessity. She had to navigate politics, protect the crown, and manage a fractured royal court. Isabella, as her daughter, was raised in a world of diplomacy, secrets, and shifting alliances. She grew up in the lavish palaces of Paris, but these walls held whispers of betrayal, war, and fear. Every decision made around her was part of a larger political game, and when the time came, Isabella would become a move in that game herself. A very young move. Her royal blood made her valuable, and soon both the French and English crowns would set their eyes on her, not as a girl, but as a symbol of peace. By the year 1396, Europe was bleeding from a war that had dragged on for over half a century, the infamous 100 Years' War between England and France. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Both nations were exhausted. Kings and counselors on both sides were desperate for peace, even if just a fragile one. That's when the idea was born. Seal a truce, not with ink, but with a marriage. On one side of the deal stood King Richard II of England, aged 29. A man with a crown, but no heir, no queen. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died just a few years earlier, and Richard had been grieving ever since. On the other side was Isabella of Valois, daughter of the French King Charles VI. She was royalty, she was valuable, but she was also just 6 years old. To the royal advisors, that didn't matter. Love wasn't part of the equation. In their eyes, Isabella wasn't a child. She was a treaty dressed in silk. If Richard married her, England and France could pause the bloodshed, a truce would be signed, lands could be spared, nobles could breathe again. And so the bargain was made. Some thought it was madness, that such an age gap was too extreme even by medieval standards. Others whispered that it was a smart move. Marrying the young princess wouldn't give Richard a queen to rule beside him, but it would give him leverage to the world. It was a royal union, but in truth, it was a political trade. And Isabella, barely taller than the throne she'd sit on, was the price of peace. 1396, in a quiet ceremony held in France, a proxy wedding was arranged. Little Isabella of Valois, only 6 years old, was married on paper to King Richard II of England. She wasn't even present at the first ceremony. Instead, a nobleman stood in for the king, To Isabella, it was probably just another formal day in her royal life, but everything changed in November of that same year when she met her new husband in person. The real wedding took place near Calais, dressed in a deep velvet gown and wearing a crown that looked too heavy for her tiny frame. Isabella was carried down the aisle. Historical records say she cried during the ceremony, not understanding what was happening, just knowing that something was very wrong after the wedding. She was taken to Windsor Castle in England, far from her home, her language, and her mother. The court gave her a private household with ladies in waiting and tried to make her feel like a queen. But she was still a child. Her chambers were filled with toys and dolls. She played, she laughed. She missed home, though. She was a queen by title. Isabella's days were more like a child's than a ruler's. She spent hours learning languages, reading fairy tales, and staring out windows wondering when she'd see her family again behind palace walls. She was both royal and prisoner, adored by some, forgotten by others, and still too young to understand the crown on her head, despite the shocking age gap. King Richard II didn't treat young Isabella like a typical royal wife. In fact, what followed after their wedding surprised many at court. Rather than pushing her into the adult world too soon, Richard kept a respectful distance. He understood, at least in part, that she was still a child. Instead of intimacy, he focused on building a bond. He visited her regularly, bringing gifts and speaking kindly. There are records of him giving her dolls, books, and miniature pets. In a world ruled by politics and war, that kind of gentleness was rare, especially from a king. Richard made sure Isabella had her own household separate from his. She was surrounded by attendants, tutors, and female companions. Her days were filled with lessons, games, and quiet walks, more like the life of a noble child than that of a queen under canon law. At the time, girls could not legally live as wives until age 12. Richard followed this rule strictly, something not all kings bothered with. His choice wasn't just legal, it was personal. Many historians believe he genuinely liked Isabella. Some even say he found comfort in her presence, especially after losing his first wife, Anne of Bohemia. Though he was nearly 30, Richard never rushed Isabella into her role. He treated her like a daughter, or perhaps a symbol of peace, something innocent in a kingdom filled with betrayal. Their strange marriage in many ways was built more on quiet understanding than royal duty. By 1399, King Richard II's grip on power was already slipping. His harsh rule, heavy taxation, and ruthless treatment of rivals had earned him many enemies among England's nobility. Still, he believed his throne was secure. So when unrest broke out in Ireland, he left England to personally lead a military campaign, leaving his kingdom dangerously exposed. That's when Henry Bolingbroke made his move. Henry, the exiled son of the powerful John of Gaunt, returned to England, not just to reclaim his inheritance, but with ambitions far greater. As Richard lingered in Ireland, Henry quickly gained support. Lords who once feared Richard now rallied behind Bolingbroke. Town after town opened its gates. Resistance was nearly non-existent. When Richard finally returned, it was too late. His authority had crumbled in his absence. He was captured and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. And just like that, England had a new ruler, Henry IV. But what of young Queen Isabella? Only 10 years old, she was suddenly a queen without a king. The court that once pampered her grew cold and distant. Under the new regime, she was removed from public life and placed under strict supervision. Though not in a dungeon, Isabella was now a prisoner in all but name. No contact with her family, no visits from loyal friends. Her letters were likely monitored, her movements controlled. For a child who once wore the crown, it was a quiet, confusing downfall. One she neither caused nor understood, but would be forced to endure. In October 1399, everything changed. King Richard II, Isabella's husband, was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who seized the throne and became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned, locked away in Pontefract Castle, and never seen in public again. Just a few months later, in early 1400, he was dead. The official story was starvation. Others whispered murder. Isabella was just 10 years old. She had no idea what would happen next, now a child widow. Isabella remained in England, no longer a queen, but still valuable, especially to the new king. Henry IV didn't want her sent back to France. Instead, he proposed something else. He wanted Isabella to marry his son, Prince Henry, the same boy who would later become the famous Henry V, but Isabella refused even. At such a young age, she made a bold choice. She saw herself as Richard's widow, and she mourned him not privately, but in public, dressed in black. She wept during ceremonies. Her loyalty to Richard remained visible, even dangerous in a court that had just overthrown him. She lived under careful watch. Every move, every word was monitored. The court didn't trust her. She was still a French princess after all, and now a living symbol of the old king's legacy. The English crown hoped time would change her mind, that eventually she'd agree to the match with Prince Henry, but she stayed firm. She didn't want a second English crown. What she wanted was to go home, but even that would take years. By June of 1401, Isabella's time in England had come to an end. She was just 11 years old and already a widow. Her husband, King Richard II, had died in captivity, and the new king, Henry IV, had no intention of letting her stay. She was no longer useful, but even her return to France was not without loss. The English crown kept her dowry. The gold jewels and political promises that had once traveled with her across the Channel were gone. She arrived back in Paris with nothing but a broken alliance and the quiet grief of a child who had grown up too fast back home. Her status had changed. No longer the Queen of England, Isabella was now a former child bride with a complicated past. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, began looking for another marriage, this time one that would benefit the French crown. 5 years passed. Then in 1406, Isabella was married again, this time to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was only a boy himself, just 11 years old. Once again, Isabella found herself in a marriage shaped more by politics than affection. This second union would be her last. In 1409, at the age of just 19, Isabella died, giving birth to her only child, a daughter named Joan. No great legacy, no throne, no power of her own, just a quiet end to a life that had never really belonged to her in the first place. Isabella of Valois wore the crown of England, but only for a moment in time. Her reign was brief, her role ceremonial, and when her husband, King Richard II, was overthrown, her position vanished with him. She had no children with the king, no power of her own, and no legacy that tied her to the English throne after his fall. History tends to remember those who ruled or those who defied. Isabella did neither. After Richard's death, England was plunged into political chaos. Henry IV took the throne. His son would later become the famous Henry V. Their stories filled the records, the chronicles, the ballads. And in the shadow of these rising figures, Isabella simply faded. She was a foreign girl, young, quiet, and soon sent back across the Channel, out of sight and out of England's memory. Even in France, she was overshadowed. Her second marriage to the Duke of Orleans was short-lived. She died in childbirth at 19, just as her life was beginning to take shape again. Centuries passed, and historians rarely spoke her name. She didn't change laws. She didn't start wars. She wasn't the subject of plays or grand portraits in the grand stage of medieval Europe. Isabella was a silent figure in the background, too young to act, too small to leave a mark. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to look back at child queens like Isabella. They now ask deeper questions. What was it like to be married off before understanding what marriage even meant? What toll did royal duty take on girls too young to know the cost? Isabella's story isn't just a footnote. It's a reminder of how easy it is for history to overlook the quiet ones, especially when they were girls. A child forced into adulthood, a little girl draped in royal silk, used in a game of crowns. She never understood. Isabella of Valois didn't lead armies. She didn't make great speeches or pass laws, but her life was shaped and shattered by the ambitions of powerful men. Her story was hidden behind political headlines, buried beneath centuries of louder names, and yet she mattered. Isabella's life reminds us how easily history forgets the vulnerable, the quiet, the ones who were never meant to rule, but were still pulled into the storm of power and politics. She was just 6 years old, and yet she wore a crown heavier than anyone could imagine. You believe stories like Isabella's deserve to be remembered. If you want to hear more untold tales of the forgotten, the silenced, and the overlooked, and help us bring them back into the light. Like this video, subscribe to History Screen, and share this story with someone who loves real history, the kind that textbooks often leave behind. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just what's remembered, it's also what's been forgotten.